We're not talking about actors. We mean a real monster.
I brought her back. She'll live and I'll get her another body.
I know they're gonna kiss me, but don't let anyone see me like that. Please, Doctor, help me!
Biologically speaking, it's of primary importance that man should want to mate. Hey, that's...
You don't get all your kicks from surfing, do you?
We want to be free to ride our machines without being hassled by the man. And we want to get loaded.
You think you're gonna make a slave of the world? I'll see you in hell first!
The American International Podcast.
Are you ready?
This is the American International Podcast. I'm Jeff Markin.
And I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And on this episode, we're going back to the days of the Wild West, courtesy of Roger Corman and The Oklahoma Woman from 1956.
Roger Corman directed The Oklahoma Woman, but the movie was written by Lou Rusoff. It was produced by Alex Gordon for Sunset Productions and released by the American Releasing Corporation, which was the original name of American International Pictures, as we all know.
The Oklahoma Woman stars Richard Denning as Steve Ward, Peggie Castle as Marie Oklahoma Saunders, Cathy Downs as Susan Grant, Tutch Connors as Tom Blake, Tudor Owen as Ed Grant, Martin Kingsley as Sheriff Bill Peters,
Jonathan Haze stars as Blackie Thompson, Dick Miller as the bartender, Mike, Tom Dillon as Jimmy Marsh, Edmund Cobb as Deputy Sam, Bruno VeSota as Stacy, the stagecoach driver, and Paul Blaisdell as a henchman/townsperson.
So over the credits, we see the feet of a horse as it's being ridden to town, with a Ronald Stein score doing the traditional horse walking music, dum 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 kind of thing.
You put that so well. Pulling back, we see the horse is bearing a man and walking into an old western town. The man parks his horse and asks the first person he sees where he can find Ed Grant. That man is Sheriff Bill Peters, and of course, he's a nosy man. He asks the stranger's business with Grant. Understandably, the man says it's personal. Sheriff Bill asks if he's ever seen him before, and then he asks if he's one of Oklahoma's new hired guns. This man is Steve Ward. And he says that he's no gun, but the Sheriff Bill notices that he has a gunfighter's holster. And indeed, after Steve turns to leave, Sheriff Bill snaps, "Look out!" And Steve spins, draws, and faces Bill.
The sheriff thinks Steve draws a gun like a pro, and he has an "I told you so" look on his face. We then go into Oklahoma's place, a saloon where Marie Oklahoma Saunders is dealing cards to Stacy, who is the stagecoach driver. Mike the bartender is in the background, wiping down the bar, and someone comes in to let Stacy know that his passengers are waiting.
Someone in the saloon asks about the upcoming election, saying the opposition put a vote for Grant sign on her wall. Marie says that she'll handle the election. Then she makes short work of the card game with Stacy. Stacy says that Marie should deal another round. The way she deals the cards, the game won't take long. Oklahoma doesn't like what he's implying and tells him to be careful with his thinly veiled accusations. But he's had it. He pulls money out of his pocket and throws it on the table. He tells her to take it, but she won't.
Stacy stands and he picks up his whip, which he has because he's the stagecoach driver, and the bartender immediately jumps over the bar to defend Marie, who grabs a gun from the holster of another man standing at the bar. But Stacy holds up his whip and pushes the bartender back into the bar. Marie, while pointing the gun at him, tells Stacy to take his money and go. Stacy starts to walk out, but Marie throws the money at him, which falls to the floor. She then tells him to pick it up, and when he leans over to do so, she kicks him. He backs onto the bar and stumbles down the steps and falls into the street.
Marie throws his whip after him and tells him that he better get transferred to another route. Stacy pulls a gun on her, and Steve Ward arrives to kick it out of his hand, doing so before Marie's hired guns can even shoot him.
Steve then sends Stacy on his way. As Stacy heads back to his coach, the sheriff stops him and asks what happened, and Stacy replies, "Nothing," and kicks dirt on his way back to his coach.
Meanwhile, Marie and Steve share a knowing look at each other. She nods at him, and she returns into the saloon, and he follows. The sheriff watches all this with interest. When we go back in, we see there's a new person at the bar. It's Tom Blake. But Marie doesn't have eyes for him. She's looking at Steve.
She tells Steve it's been a long time, and it turns out that Steve has been in prison for over 6 years. Steve asks what she's doing here in Silver Hill, and her reply is that he told her once that this was the only place he thought of as home, so she set up shop here figuring he'd stop by sooner or later.
What a great stalker.
She tells Steve that she can use a man of his talents, and that she owns this place free and clear, and she could be useful to him as well. but all Steve wants is to set up a ranch and settle down and retire.
Steve reminds Marie that he sent back the letter she sent while he was in prison unopened. And did she not get the hint? Steve thinks they're no good for each other, but Marie says she can be very good for him. She owns her business free and clear, and she plans to share it all with him. He hints that she acquired this by shady means, but she claims the business is 100% legit now. And she can't understand why he doesn't see the benefit of them working together, but Steve says the thing he wants most is peace. Having to side with her won't give him that. She says that there's a lot she can give him, and he argues that there's a lot more she can take away.
Steve steps outside and Marie follows. Steve notices the sheriff watching him from across the street. Marie says that the sheriff can remember any face from any wanted poster he's ever seen. She tells Steve he's going to need her, and he says that if he does, he'll come looking for her. As he saunters off, Tom Blake comes out and sarcastically asks how that reunion went.
She tells him to mind his own business. The sheriff stops Steve and challenges him. He claimed he didn't know Marie. Steve lies and says that she invited him in for a drink out of gratitude. He did save her life. The sheriff demands Steve's name, and the deputy orders him to give it. So he does. It's Steve Ward. Then the sheriff asks how long Steve is planning on staying. Steve says, as long as I want. The sheriff wants to know where he can find him if the sheriff needs him.
You won't, assures Steve as he pushes past them. The sheriff is sure that Steve is one of Oklahoma's men, but they're going to need proof before they can do anything about it. Tom and Marie have been watching this exchange from the porch of the saloon. Tom says that if Steve Ward is as good with a gun as Marie says he is, they could use him. But Marie says that it's his brains that will prove useful.
We'll see about that. Blake says that now the townspeople are stampeding behind Grant, and there isn't much time to get them to line up behind her candidate, Jimmy Marsh. They're both running for state assemblyman. Marie thinks if they take out the leader of that stampede, Grant, the herd of townsfolk will fall in line behind Marsh. And if they haven't scared Grant off yet, it's because they haven't found the right incentive, I guess. Marie tells Blake to send his new man out to Grant's place to provide such incentive and to take along a special message from her. Marie vows she will win the election. Blake says, no, we will, meaning the both of them.
Next we see Steve back on his horse riding to wherever it is he's planning on going. Simultaneously, we see Tom's men, including Blackie Thompson, ride past Ed Grant's place, hooting and hollering and shooting. Ed's daughter, Susan, is outside. She picks up a rifle and hides behind a trough as Tom's men ride by a few more times.
They were told not to shoot to kill, so they don't. After the drive-by, they head back to town. Steve, riding towards this commotion, hides in a stand of trees as the men pass. Once they're gone, he gets back on the road heading in the direction of the Grant Ranch, only to get shot at by Susan.
Steve sneaks around behind Susan and manages to pull away her gun. The two of them wrestle, and Steve says the last time they saw each other, they were struggling much like this, only it was over there in that trough, and she wasn't wearing any clothes.
That sounds problematic.
Susan thinks that this is something she would remember.
He says that at the time, he was 9 and she was 2, and I don't think saying that makes it any better. He looks very smug right now. Finally, she remembers his name, and he comments that she's changed a lot since then, and in all the right places. Gross.
And then, not a moment too soon, Susan's father, Ed Grant, rides up. He had heard the shooting, and he asked Susan if this was the guy responsible. She tells him that no, this is Ephraim Ward's grandson, Steve. Ed decides that there is a resemblance and shakes Steve's hand. Susan asks Steve if he saw the men who were terrorizing her.
Steve lies and says that they never went past him. Susan says they must have. There's only one trail back to town. But Steve doubles down on the lie, and Marie goes back inside in a huff.
Steve pulls out some papers and says that Ed is the executor of his grandfather's estate. It's been 4 years since Steve's grandfather passed away. Ed says that he can take Steve to see the place, but it really isn't much of a ranch anymore. That's all fine by Steve. All he wants is peace and quiet.
He actually gets another lie in there and says that he hasn't been there in 4 years because he's been on the move.
The ranch is in walking distance, so there's no reason to load up the horses.
Ed asks how much money Steve has, and Steve asks why, and Ed says you'll know why when you see the place. Steve has only a paltry $38, but all he wants to do is to be left alone. Ed thinks he won't be much of a neighbor, and Steve agrees. When they see the ranch, it's a ramshackle building. Ed was forced to sell the cattle to pay off debts and taxes, and a tornado ravaged the house. Steve looks at it and says $38 isn't going to do much.
Steve laments that there goes a nice set of dreams.
Ed says that he'd have tried to help keep it up, but all his money is going to fight off that woman. And Steve correctly guesses that he means Marie. Ed asks if Steve knows her, and Steve lies again.
Then Ed says that maybe the bank would be willing to give him a loan to help him get started fixing up the ranch and making it habitable.
Ed tells Steve that he should do the neighborly thing and come eat dinner with them. But Steve reminds him that he doesn't do good neighbor stuff.
Then Ed leaves and Steve starts to work. Back in town, Tom Blake is in the saloon. He says there's only 4 days left until Election Day. Marie is convinced that that's plenty of time for her to swing the election her way. Tom asks if Steve is going to be any help with that. He notes that since Steve has come to town, he's brought out the woman in Marie. And that he's always stood between them. Marie laughs and tells Tom that Steve isn't standing between them. Tom was never that close.
This doesn't sit well with Blake, who asks for a drink. Later out at the ranch, Susan is returning Steve's horse. She shows him a note that she found wrapped around a rock that was thrown through their window during the raid. It says, "If you want your daughter to stay alive, get out of the county."
Steve says that's playing a bit rough. He wants to know what's so important about this election anyway. Susan says somebody has to stand up to her, meaning Marie. Marie is always the her in any scenario in this town. Susan asks again if Steve had seen the men from earlier, and again Steve says that he didn't see anybody. She says that he must have. He couldn't have missed them coming down the trail. But Steve insists that this isn't his fight.
He pulls the both sides of the same card, and she calls him a fence straddler. And that's hard to do when it's a barbed wire fence, but he claims his hide is tough enough to take it. Good for him. She can't decide whether to hate him or feel sorry for him, so she just leaves.
Elsewhere, Ed Grant is riding to town when his horse is stopped by Tom Blake, who has placed his horse right in the middle of the trail. They have a brief exchange where we learn that Marie is after Ed's property and Ed isn't going to let her get it, and to help save it, he intends to win this election.
Tom wonders what good a dead assemblyman will be to the voters or to his daughter. Ed growls at Tom to let him pass, and Tom gets out of the way.
Now back at the saloon, the piano player is doing his thing as Marie comes down the stairs. The place looks busier than we've seen it, but apparently it's rather quiet for a Saturday night.
Marie goes over to Jimmy Marsh's table. He's her candidate in this election. He is soused, and says even he thinks he's likely to lose to Grant. They lost Nick Anderson, I guess one of the other townspeople, who's now stumping for the enemy. He stands up and gives a little fake speech saying that a vote for him is a vote for Oklahoma Saunders and for corruption, and she's very angry now. She grabs him by the lapels, but Jimmy Marsh just begs Marie to fire him.
Instead, Marie escorts Jimmy Marsh out, and as she's doing this, the sheriff stops her. He asks how long she's known Steve Ward, and she asks who? The sheriff says he's the fellow who saved you from being shot today. Oh, I only just met him. The sheriff lets her go with that, but he's not buying it.
The sheriff chuckles that Grant is going to beat Marsh by a landslide. Marie says, "That's what you said the last time when I ran Marsh against Jackson." Sheriff Bill says he doesn't underestimate her anymore, and he leaves, just as Tom Blake arrives. Marie asks Tom if he got anywhere with Grant, and the answer is no. She thinks they've been polite long enough, and says, "Bring me the head of Dick Anderson. No, bring me Dick Anderson by any means necessary." And then they go inside to talk. Oh yeah, I guess they do just talk because they never have even kissed. It seemed like they were implying something else, though.
Next we see someone helping with the Ed Grant campaign. He's putting up posters for Ed Grant.
He's very old.
And then Tom's riders ride by and trample him with their horses.
No, they don't. He just falls down. But either way, he's dead. Next we see Ed in town giving a speech. Then one bandit rides past, shooting his gun, not at anybody. Ed slowly ambles to the front of the crowd and pulls his gun out of his holster, tries to shoot back, but with no success.
And then we see that Sheriff Peters is appointing a few new deputies, at least through the election. The sheriff instructs them to take the gunmen alive if they can, but if they can't, kill them.
Later, Steve is in town. He ties up his horse as the sheriff strolls past. Sheriff Peters asks why Steve never mentioned that he was Ephraim Ward's grandson. Steve rudely quips that it was never the sheriff's business, not then or now. And then he leaves. Deputy Sam quips, "There goes your gunslinger, without a gun." But Sheriff Bill actually believes this. Deputy Sam says that he could be wrong, but Bill says he's not wrong too often.
At the Grant Ranch, Ed is handing a holster and revolver to Susan, telling her that she should keep this on her for the next few days. Marie's playing hard. Ed tells her that the sheriff has appointed a few more deputies, and one of them will be by to watch the place.
Ed's wondering if this is all worth it. Susan thinks that her dad sounds as hopeless as Steve does. Ed tells Susan not to be so hard on Steve. He's a troubled man, and Ed wishes he knew why.
Later, Steve comes knocking at the door. Susan answers, and Steve says he came by to thank her father for putting a good word for him with the bank. They're going to give him the loan so he can start up the ranch again. But Susan doesn't want to talk about that. She wants to talk about how a good man was killed today because he stood up for something he believed in. There's a war going on in town, and Steve won't take a side.
She accuses him of hating people, or does he just hate himself? This strikes a nerve. Steve winces at her, and then he leaves.
Now we're back at the saloon. Marie is up in her room when Sheriff Peters knocks on her door. She lets him in and says that he's on dangerous ground. Downstairs, she's a saloon keeper, but up here, she's a woman.
Ooh.
But he's not going to be distracted by her.
He can't be bought with that.
He reminds her that he once told her to leave town. He says he's going to take that all back now because one of Grant's men was trampled, and he's going to see that she's charged with his murder.
Or die trying, he says, and Marie looks a little too gleeful at that possibility. She says she's not going anywhere. And then, in a burst of really bad timing, Tom Blake shoves his way into the room with Dick Anderson in tow. The sheriff asks Dick why he's there, and Dick rotely repeats that he's there of his own free will.
Frustrated, the sheriff says, "You're lying," and pushes past him and leaves the room. Marie tells Dick Anderson that she knows that he's been helping Grant. Anderson says that his wife made him do it.
He throws her under the stagecoach there.
Marie goes to the safe and pulls out some papers and asks Anderson if he remembers these. She has $700 worth of IOUs from him, and what would his wife think if she knew?
She says that his wife would be very unhappy to learn what he was spending his money on, implying that that's his floozy tab. Anderson says that it's not him, it's the women. In this timeline, women can vote, and they've all pledged theirs to Grant. Marie dismisses Dick, who gets one final warning from Blake as he leaves. Blake tells Marie that it's time to do things his way, and he spins his gun on his finger for emphasis. But Marie adds a twist. Ed is up in Saddle Bend this evening at a meeting, so Susan's home alone now, and not in a Kevin McAllister kind of way.
Tom says that the Grant place is being watched by one of the new deputies, and Marie suggests that maybe one of Tom's men could become that deputy. He could go to her and tell her father is hurt and take her away. No noise, no fuss. Then she turns to her table where she has a picture of Steve. Tom notices this and is a little disappointed. "When are you going to get rid of him?" he asks.
Kind of weird she chose to antagonize her only ally like that. Later, Blake meets up with Blackie Thompson, who he's going to send in to do the deputy swap.
Blackie is the one who is going to be impersonating the deputy and take care of Susan. Blackie is a little surprised that this time he'll be riding up there alone, but Tom says it's safer that way. He also gives Blackie a warning. If something goes wrong and Blackie gets caught, Tom will kill him.
We're still with Blake as he goes back to town, but he runs into the sheriff, who tells Blake he's got 3 new deputies. Sheriff Bill says that any attempt at election interference, even pulling down a poster, will get the attemptee shot. Blake says that he's telling the wrong man. There's a new boss in town. Bill wants to know who it is, so they dance around that a bit. Blake says that he'll tell him for some consideration. Blake wants to stay in town even after the election. He likes it there. Bill asks if he's selling out Marie. Blake says that she sold him out first for the new guy. Bill still has to ask which new guy. Blake won't speak his name, but suggests Bill goes to his 8-year-old wanted posters till he sees a familiar face. He reminds the sheriff of this consideration that he promised, but Bill just leaves.
Tom goes into the saloon, and as he passes by Marie, he tells her that they'll be all right now, both of them. So Sheriff Peters and Deputy Sam do indeed come across an old poster with Steve's headshot on it.
It's a nice 3/4 profile shot.
The sheriff is going to telegraph for more information, then pick up Steve and bring him in.
Now, as Steve sleeps fitfully on his bedroll in his front yard, and the deputy who's watching Susan is nodding off on a hill outside her house, Blackie sneaks up behind him and attacks. The deputy gets the butt of Blackie's rifle to his head, and then Blackie rides over to Susan's house. He claims to be the deputy watching her and tells her that her dad's been hurt pretty bad. She assumes by Marie. She goes to get her horse from the pen. The horse screams and Steve hears it. He's awake now.
Blackie offers to help her with the horse so they can get back into town. "To Silver Hill?" she asks. "That's right," says Blackie. Susan awkwardly pulls her gun from her holster. "My father was speaking in Saddle Bend tonight." Blackie calmly says you're mistaken. Before reaching for her gun, he pulls her arm over her head and it goes off, alerting Steve over at his place.
Blackie awkwardly starts hog-tying Susan, around the neck even. And then there's a cutaway, and the next time we see her, she's up on her horse. Despite him being a much shorter man than Susan, he got her up there somehow. And Steve is trotting over there. He sees what's going on and sneaks up behind Blackie, who's still trying to securely rope Susan atop that horse. Steve pulls him away, and they fight. Blackie hits the dirt once, twice, and that's enough. He draws his gun. Steve dances over to him and kicks it away. He's good at kicking away guns.
Now in our Blackie retreats as Steve pulls down Susan from her horse. She points out that Blackie is getting away, and Steve starts after him, but then Steve just stops and lets him go. Susan asks him why he let him go. Was it someone that he knew? Was he a friend of Steve's? And Steve tells her to go back into the house. He'll keep an eye on things here until her father gets back. Susan tells Steve that she hates him. No, she doesn't even know he's alive. Steve thinks he can prove her wrong and kisses her. Then he tells her again to go back in the house.
Ugh, another Roger Corman movie with a forced kiss. She goes inside and she's confused because she doesn't know how to quite vocalize the feeling of being assaulted. But Steve looks very happy about what he's done. Yuck.
But as promised, Steve stays until Ed returns.
The night's activities probably tired Steve out because he's sleeping past dawn. Sheriff Bill and Deputy Sam pay him a visit. They call him by his wanted poster alias, and Steve says that that's ancient history. Bill wants to know if Marie Saunders is ancient history too, if he came out to help her with the campaign. Steve reiterates that he only came out for peace and quiet, but he might as well have moved into a railroad station. Bill has Sam rifle through his belongings, and Sam only finds the one pistol that they saw when they met him. Bill considers this a badge of Steve's profession, and Sheriff Bill says that if he catches Steve wearing that holster in town, he'll kill him. Bill also tells Steve that he's going to warn all the bankers and merchants not to do business with him, and Steve says that if Sheriff Bill ever sees Steve wearing his pistol in town, that means Steve's gunning for the sheriff. Then they leave.
Now we're back at the saloon. Jimmy Marsh comes in and sits down at a table where Tom is already seated. Jimmy Marsh asks Tom how the campaign is going. Tom tells him to shut up and throws a drink in his face. Then Marie comes over and says that the Grant girl has identified Blackie.
If this gets back to them, they're screwed. Despite that, the battle between Blake and Marsh gets more heated and more childish. Marie threatens to send them both to their rooms without dinner.
Somewhere outside, Steve is stepping out and he bumps into Susan. Susan tells him that her father is furious about what the sheriff has done about Steve and his bank loan, and she says she wishes he had told her about himself. Then she'd have understood why he was reluctant to shoot Blackie. The sheriff comes up and asks Steve if he's come to town to tell him he's leaving, but Steve says that he'll be here long after the sheriff is gone.
That evening, Steve is outside the feed store. That's not where he's going. He climbs up to the second story of the saloon. As he climbs, a letter that had been in his pocket falls to the ground. Blake, who had been watching, retrieves the letter.
Steve continues to climb and sneaks into Marie's room. She's happy to see him. He asked if she was the one who sent Blackie to Grant's place. He would have gotten away with it, but Steve had fought him off. You fought him off, says Marie. That's going to cost me a lot of money.
But he wants to know if she's the one that told the sheriff who he was. She says no, but she did warn him that he was going to find out.
But she doesn't want to talk about that. She wants to talk about the two of them. But the reason Steve has come was for a business proposition. He's hoping to have his ranch as collateral for a loan to get it up and running again. But Marie says that Steve is a poor risk because Sheriff Peters is bound to run him out of town. She asked him what it is he's looking for, and he says respectability, maybe.
Marie says that enough money will buy respectability and offers to win him a seat in Congress and then the Senate. He's not interested, so she says no to that loan.
So the deputies have found Blackie and they're bringing him in. The deputy that was injured at the Grant place has identified him, and the stagecoach driver spotted him. The sheriff wants to grill him right away, but Blackie knows his rights and won't speak. So he's taken inside and put in a cell.
Sheriff Bill tells the deputies that Blackie's not going to open his mouth for anything but a cigarette. Bill dispatches Deputy Jim to get the Grants and bring him to town. They're going to stay there until the election. He says, don't let them out of your sight.
Now back in the saloon, Tom is leaning against the bar, and the bartender compliments his new coat. Jimmy Marsh comes over and says that Grant is speaking in town tonight to rally the voters, who still think that Grant is going to win, but they know better. Marie comes down and tells Tom that they caught Blackie. Tom assures her he'll keep quiet, but Marie says only until the sheriff finds time to really go to work on him. Since Grant is speaking tonight, everyone in town will be there, including the sheriff and his men. This is the last opportunity Tom will have to talk to Grant before the election.
Blake says that he's got a big night of work ahead of him, and she snaps at it to get to it. Over at the jail, Deputy Sam is sitting in a chair sleeping peacefully, while Blackie is moldering in his cell. We see outside the window, and so does Blackie. Blake's out there. Blackie starts calling out for Sam to open up the window. He says it's really hot in there, but he's really trying to get rescued. Sam complains about this, but finally he relents and opens it. He sits down to go back to sleep, but then Blake reaches in the window and conks the deputy on the back with the butt of his gun, and the deputy goes down.
So Tom climbs through the window. Get me out of here, says Blackie. Tom asks Blackie if he's told him anything, and Blackie says, "No, what do you think?" Tom says that he thinks that's good. He pulls out a letter and asks Blackie to grab the end of it. Tom pulls it back, tearing it. Then he shoots Blackie and climbs back out the window.
After coming to, Sam goes to find the sheriff. He reports that Blackie got shot and that this bit of a letter was on the ground beside him. Bill looks at it and then organizes a roadblock/manhunt for Steve Ward. Susan, who's there, protests, but they pay her no mind and ride off. Then she hops on her horse and chases after them. They're all headed out to Steve's, but somehow Susan gets there first.
Susan warns Steve that the sheriff is coming to kill him. She tells him to go that way, and she'll lead them off this way, so they split up.
Over at the meeting hall, the meeting is over, and Ed's out, glad-handing the townsfolk. One of the men notices that there's no deputy guarding Ed, but Ed says it's fine. All he has to do is walk over to the hotel where Susan's going to meet him. He strolls off, but immediately gets nabbed by Blake and his men. They have a final offer. They'll give him $15,000 for the ranch as long as he withdraws from the race and gets out of the county.
But Ed's not going to take this deal. He says if he did, he'd be no better than Jimmy Marsh. So Tom karate chops him in the neck, and Grant falls to the ground. Tom tells one of his boys to pick him up, but Ed's dead.
This turn of events is too much for his men. They're done with this election crap. That's okay, Blake muses. He doesn't need them. He doesn't need anyone. He lightly conceals Grant's body and moves out.
Elsewhere, Susan's distraction apparently worked because the sheriff gives up on his chase. They're going to have to wait another day to find Steve Ward.
Having succeeded at her plan, Susan rides back into town. She sees Sam, who demands to know where her father is. She's confused. She thought he was at the hotel, but Deputy Sam says that he never showed up. He grabs her so that they can go search together.
Back at the saloon, Marie comes downstairs. There are a few people in there, but things seem quiet. The bartender tells her that no one is buying drinks tonight. She asks him if he knows where Tom is, and the bartender tells her that Tom is lying down in the back with a headache.
Jimmy Marsh blows into the saloon, reporting that Ed Grant is missing and the whole town is looking for him. When they find him, ... Marie starts to actually look worried for the first time. Then, two floozies who had been on the floor give each other a look, and then they walk out. Marie demands to know where they're going, but they're not going to stop and give 2 weeks' notice. So she tells them they're fired as they walk out the door. Then the remaining 4 customers also hightail it out of there, but Marsh and Marie stay behind to do shots.
Steve comes in. He tells Marie that he had lost a letter there. He asks her if she found it, and she says she didn't. He doesn't believe her, but she tells him that she could never lie to him. She has him look into her eyes to prove it. Then Steve asks the bartender if he knows anything about it, but the bartender doesn't know anything. He's just a bartender.
Someone's taking his role a little too seriously. Marie decides that she's going upstairs. The bartender asks if maybe they should close, but Marie says she'll tell them when to close.
Marsh is waiting outside when Steve comes out. Marsh asks him if the letter in question was addressed to Steve Ward, and Steve says yes. Then Marsh asks if he had seen this letter in the possession of another, if that someone might want to kill him, and Steve supposes so. So Marsh tells him that Tom Blank had the letter that afternoon, and that Marie would know where to find him. As Steve turns to go, Marsh asks him to tell Marie goodbye for him.
He's leaving town forever. Then we cut to Susan and Sam standing before a clutch of townspeople. A man comes up and whispers something to Sam. A second later, Sam, Susan, and all the townspeople leave.
Now we cut to Marie's room. She's sitting in there when Steve enters. And back downstairs, the bartender goes to Tom to inform him that Steve had just come to see Marie. Tom says that this will solve his problem.
We go back to Sam, Susan, and the townsfolk. Susan is distraught because now her dad's body has been found. Townspeople are organizing a lynch mob. Susan tells Sam to stop them. It's not what her dad would have wanted.
Back in Marie's room, Steve is giving Marie an hour to get out of town before he tells the sheriff everything he knows. And as he's talking, Tom sneaks into the room with his gun drawn. Having caught Steve off guard, he tells Marie to tie Steve up. Back out in the street, the crowd is jaunting around looking for someone to blame for Grant's murder.
Up in Marie's room, she's taking the belts off her robe to tie Steve hand and foot.
Marie asks Tom what they're going to do with him, and Tom says that Steve's going to save their necks. Outside, Sheriff Peters and a deputy come back into town to find the gathered crowd. Someone tells the sheriff that they killed Grant. The sheriff tells them all to go home. Then Tom, from the shadows, shoots the sheriff. He throws out the gun and ducks back inside.
Tom has tossed the gun out to draw the crowd in that direction, and it works. They find the gun, and Deputy Sam looks it over. He says it belongs to Steve Ward, and he'd know it anywhere. So, the mob reroutes in pursuit of Steve.
In the saloon, the bartender tells Marie that the mob is coming, so Marie finally lets him go home. Then she goes out to meet the crowd.
That's where we learn his name is Mike, too. Marie has her gun drawn and says that she'll shoot the first man that sets foot on her porch. Deputy Sam demands to know where Steve is, but Marie doesn't know. The front half of the mob starts flinging mud at her. She allows it for a few seconds, then she retreats inside. Susan sees this and cringes at this turn of events.
After locking the saloon door, Marie runs up and unties Steve, who thanks her, and climbs out the window.
She tells him to get out of Dodge.
As he reaches the ground, the mob spots him, grabs him, and starts dragging him to the center of town.
They easily catch Steve and hustle him off. Susan implores Sam to stop them, and he does. With his deputies, he takes Steve into custody. As the deputies march Steve off to the jail cell, Steve tries to explain the whole frame-up. He was tied up in Marie's room when the sheriff was killed. Tom took his gun to shoot the sheriff so he could frame Steve. Steve tells Susan to go see Marie, who can corroborate his crazy story.
Marie has poured herself a drink when Susan gets to the saloon and busts down the door. Marie tells Susan to go away, but Susan asks how she can let an innocent man, a man she allegedly loves, to be accused of killing the sheriff and Blackie, 2 crimes that he didn't commit. Marie says that she doesn't love him, she hates him.
Everybody hates him.
Susan says she wants the truth, and Marie breaks a bottle over the bar and lunges at Susan.
An awkward cat fight ensues. There are kicks, pushing, dresses are torn, hair is pulled, punches are thrown, awkwardly, of course. Then it's over, and Susan demands that Marie write a confession down. She produces a posted note-sized piece of paper and a pencil. Marie contends that she could beat Susan if she had anything to fight for, but she complies and starts filling in the confession. Susan barks at her to hurry up.
Susan wins, I guess. they just kind of stop. Here, sign this.
Then Susan jogs the confession over to the jail cell.
Marie is packing up to skip town. Tom goes in and asks what she's doing, but he knows. He says there's something that she's owed him for 5 years now, and he kisses her.
I says Blake is pissed at her for squealing and decides his blue balls have waited long enough, so he kisses her. Then he tells her that she wasn't worth the wait.
Tom climbs out the window and heads to the roof. Then Steve comes into Marie's room. I guess the note worked, and rather quickly, Marie points to the window, and Steve climbs out the window, and he too goes up to the roof to confront Tom. They scuffle as a crowd gathers in the street to watch, including Susan and Deputy Sam.
Once Steve is out, Tom immediately starts shooting at him, so Steve has to hide. As he starts climbing towards the roof, he grabs a 2x4, throws it at Blake, hits him in the arm, and thus Tom drops his gun. Then both men are on the roof, and the two slug it out as the lynch mob watches.
As this is going on, Marie is sneaking out with the few bags she was able to pack. Eventually, Steve wins the fight and drags Tom down to the street to the waiting crowd.
Marie, on her horse, hurtles out of town, but she drops her money box, the only thing she really wanted to take with her. The town who had been chasing her stops where it lands to scoop up the money, I guess. Then we see a war-weary Susan and Steve holding each other, walking off in the opposite direction, and that's the end.
You're listening to the American International Podcast, where we're discussing The Oklahoma Woman from 1956.
The Oklahoma Woman was originally going to be called The Girls of Hangtown. Production began at the Universal Studios lot in December of 1955.
It was the third of 4 westerns Corman directed for American Releasing Corporation, which would later become American International Pictures. The others were Five Guns West, Apache Woman, and Gunslinger. Special effects technician Paul Blaisdell had a cameo role in the film as one of the townspeople.
Apache Woman and the Oklahoma Woman were ideas generated by AIP. The other 2 westerns he directed for AIP, Five Guns West and Gunslinger, were Corman's original ideas.
The Oklahoma Woman was produced by Sunset Productions, one of the independent production units that would make movies for ARC/AIP. Corman had his own unit, Palo Alto, but worked for the other units like Sunset as well. It was the first movie from Sunset. The second would be It Conquered the World, also directed by Corman.
The movie was made for $60,000 in glorious superscope. Corman said, quote, he tried to create a bigger look than the budget might indicate and save time and money in the process. He experimented shooting consecutively the components of multiple scenes that faced in one direction, then reversing the angle and shooting them all in the opposite directions. He said this made it easier for him to match backgrounds and wardrobe, but, he said, it was too difficult for the actors, and since then, I've tended to shoot more in sequence.
The Oklahoma Woman was the first of several collaborations between Roger Corman and cinematographer Frederick E. West.
AIP's press book for the movie accentuated the prurient when they highlighted the fight between Castle's and Downs' character, saying, quote, "The two beautiful glamour girls let their hair down and rip, tear, and claw for some of the most violent film footage in years." And they really overpromised and underdelivered on that scene.
According to the press book, Peggie Castle had more to offer than just her shapely figure, though. ARC said that Castle came through in top fashion when asked to display her talents with a whip and a gun. As for Downs, ARC declared that she enjoyed her role in Oklahoma Woman more than any previous film part, and her agent has been instructed to be on the lookout for more starring parts calling for the same spirit and fire.
Both Downs and Castle insisted that they receive top billing. Downs believed that as the love interest of leading man Richard Denning, she deserved the honor and was told she would get it. But that was before Corman signed Peggie Castle to the title role. Castle was one of the biggest stars of 50s B movies and a bigger name than Downs. Producer Alex Gordon said, quote, "Both ladies felt their names should be first. You'd think we were featuring Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson." Castle won the battle, but to placate Downs, she was promised the lead in another ARC film, and the type size on the two actresses' name and press material was identical in size.
The Oklahoma Woman was released on June 15, 1956, on a double bill with Female Jungle. The press book suggested that theater owners make their own wanted posters with the following message: "Wanted, a man to tame the Queen of the Outlaws, the Queen of Sin, the Oklahoma Woman." For further information, contact this theater.
He also recommended holding a whip demonstration in the lobby, confidently declaring that every town has a whip expert, man or woman. Call a few horse stables and harness shops to locate one. Arrange for lobby demonstrations during picture breaks with girl expert dressed in cowgirl costume doing her stuff in front of a large Oklahoma Woman display.
Guidelines for the Oklahoma Woman include Queen of the Outlaws, Queen of Sin.
Ripped by raw violence, a whip-wielding she-devil.
No man could tame her. No man could forget her.
Ripping, tearing, clawing, with all the fury of savage wildcats.
Variety found the fight between the two female leads to be a novel development, but the movie itself was considered straight out of the stables. CEA Film Report found more to like, finding the movie full of action and praising the fight between Denning and Connors on the roof.
The Monthly Film Bulletin said the movie was below average. Poorly photographed in superscope, consisting of a series of loosely connected incidents which offer little scope for dramatic effect. A competent performance by Tudor Owen stands out amongst an undistinguished cast.
Another reviewer called it probably Corman's dullest film.
The Oklahoma Woman was one of the earliest AIP features syndicated for television. It was released by Screen Entertainment in 1964. That was prior to the formation of AIP's television division, AITV.
And Susan Hart currently holds the copyright for this film.
This was one of ARC's or AIP's earlier films, so obviously we'd be seeing the cast in other movies, some before, but most after. Richard Denning, who played Steve Ward, was in The Day the World Ended, an American Releasing Corporation film from 1955. He was also in Girls in Prison, also ARC in 1956, and Naked Paradise in 1957.
Cathy Downs, who played Susan Grant, had previously appeared in The Phantom for 10,000 Leagues from ARC in 1955, and would go on to appear in The She-Creature in 1956, and The Amazing Colossal Man in 1957.
Mike Touch Connors, who played Tom Blake, was in the ARC film The Day the World Ended, 1956, and he went on to appear in The Flesh and the Spur and Shake, Rattle, and Rock, both in 1956, Voodoo Woman in 1957, and Suicide Battalion in 1958.
Martin Kingsley, who played Sheriff Bill Peters, would go on to appear in Gunslinger in 1956.
Now we have two men who are in a lot of AIP films. I'll start. Jonathan Haze, who played Blackie Thompson, appeared in the first ARC movie, The Fast and the Furious, 1954. And we saw him again in Five Guns West and Apache Woman and The Day the World Ended, 1955. He was in Gunslinger, 1956, and The Flesh and the Spur in an uncredited role that same year. In 1957, he appeared in It Conquered the World, Naked Paradise, Rock All Night, and the saga of the Viking women and their voyage to the waters of the Great Sea Serpent. In 1958, he appeared in Teenage Caveman, and he took a little AIP break, coming back in The Terror in 1963. And that same year, he was in X, The Man with X-Ray Eyes. The last movie we have for him here is Bloodbath, 1966.
And Richard Miller as the bartender previously appeared in Apache Woman from ARC in 1955 and would appear in Gunslinger They Conquered the World, Naked Paradise, The Undead, Rock All Night, and Sorority Girl, 1957. A Bucket of Blood in 1959. The Premature Burial in 1962. He appeared with Jonathan Haze in The Terror and X, the Man with the X-Ray Eyes in 1963. He would also appear uncredited in Ski Party in 1965. The Wild Angels in 1966. The Trip in 1967. The Wild Racers in 1968. And finally in Truck Turner in 1974.
Tom Dillon, who played Jimmy Marsh, would go on to appear in Night Tide in 1963, and Edmund Cobb, who was Deputy Sam, appeared in Girls in Prison, The She Creature, Runaway Daughters, and Drag Strip Girl, all in 1956. The Amazing Colossal Man and Motorcycle Gang, both in 1957. The Bonnie Parker Story in 1958, in an uncredited role. And he came back for Tales of Terror in 1962.
And lastly, we have Bruno VeSota as Stacy. We first saw him in The Fast and the Furious from ARC in 1954. He appeared in Female Jungle in 1955, which he also directed. We see him again in Gunslinger and The Undead and Rock All Night. And Daddy-O in 1958. He appeared in A Bucket of Blood and Giant Leashes in 1959. He makes an uncredited appearance in Night Tide in 1961. And also in Invasion of the Star Creatures in 1962. But that's because he was busy directing that one too. And he would also appear in The Haunted Palace in 1963 and Bunny O'Hare in 1971.
Boy, that was a lot.
That was a lot for what is essentially a lost film. We were able to dig up a lot on this one. So the only thing left to discuss is our personal thoughts on this movie. So Cheryl, tell me what you thought of Oklahoma Woman using our AIP scale where A is awesome, I is intermediate, and P is pathetic.
I would probably have a higher opinion of this movie had we not watched the similarly plotted but superlatively acted Gunslinger not 1 week ago. The Gunslinger episode would have come out 2 weeks prior to the day that this episode was released, if you want to go back and listen to it. You can see the parallels between both early Corman westerns, even though they did not share a screenwriter. A female saloon owner with a head for business and a bod and general inclination for sin. A righteous young woman who spends the whole movie exhorting the male lead to do right, as she herself fights the good fight despite losing a loved one. And there's a morally gray anti-hero who kind of saves the day despite not wanting to do any such thing. And of course, Martin Kingsley, Bruno VeSota, Dick Miller, and Jonathan Haze hover around the periphery in their small to medium-sized roles. But those are surface similarities that really don't extend any further. Cathy Downs is no Beverly Garland. Garland plays a total badass, and Downs is much more milquetoast. There's no freaking way Jake Haze could have roped up Rose Hood from Gunslinger and then gotten her up on horseback. I feel like Susan must have helped Blackie get her up there. Beverly Garland is convincing when she throws a punch or shoots a gun, and Downs is not. I have no shade to throw on Peggie Castle. I think Maria is probably the most compelling character in the whole movie, and she's just as good a character as Erica Page from Gunslinger. She and Allison Haze could easily bring any town to its knees if they worked together, but both are pretty terrible at choosing minions. I found Richard Denning to be a little boring, but as an actor, I think he's capable of more charm and charisma than John Ireland from Gunslinger, whom I just hated. Honestly, you can say that about a lot of male actors. Here, though, Steve is constantly demanding that he be allowed to be dull. He just wants to be left to his bedroll in the front yard of his dilapidated shack of a house. All right, Steve, you go enjoy that. However, both of these anti-heroes are very pushy when it comes to kissing unwilling women. But at least Kane Miro never reminisced about wrestling with a naked 2-year-old. There are definitely some issues with ignoring consent in both films that don't sit well with me watching this movie in the here and now. You could say that Tutch Connors as Blake makes a more effective henchman than Jonathan Haze in Gunslinger, but both were emasculated by their female boss/love interest to the same degree. Tom Blake waits 5 years for a kiss? That is an inhuman amount of patience. And then she's not even a good kisser. Such a schmo. But at least Oklahoma's preferred lover doesn't shoot Blake in the gut. The Oklahoma Woman has an election story that you can't even call a subplot. It takes up so much screen time. And then nearly half the town gets killed in the run-up to the election to a vaguely defined state office that will either make or break the cunning Marie. But in the end, all these plot points don't matter. There isn't even going to be an election. One party died and one left town. I guess the governor will have to pick a new assemblyman or whatever, and it's not going to matter to Marie, and it certainly doesn't matter to us, the viewers. It just seemed like a colossal waste of time. I did like the sets better in Oklahoma Woman as compared to Gunslinger. Silver Hill feels more like a real lived-in old western town. Dusty like a Dust Bowl town ought to be, with buildings that look multidimensional as opposed to mere facades. Town population here is at least in the double digits. They have enough people to form a mob when the occasion demands one, so good for them. I don't know why it's so hard to evaluate Oklahoma Woman on its own, but it's likely because the movie's overall just really mediocre. There's nothing in this so bad it's a good column here, save a few funny lines and the ever-expressive Dick Miller doing sterling work in the background of every scene he's in. I don't think Dick Miller got the memo that he's just a glorified extra here, and good for him for acting like a main character even before he had any lines. So this movie's not bad, it's just not enough of anything to push the needle either too awesome or pathetic. Oklahoma Woman lands squarely in the middle of our scale, and I give it an I. What do you think, Jeff?
This is going to be interesting because this is what I wrote when I was falling asleep last night. So
Cool.
The Oklahoma Woman was a movie I was really looking forward to watching for this podcast, mostly because it was a difficult one to track down. I didn't expect it to be good. I figured if it was, it would be well remembered and lamented as a nearly lost film. I just wanted to have seen it. And I guess I have no regrets. What Corman presents to us here is a standard film from Lou Rusoff's script, probably brought in on time and under budget as is the Corman way. But there's nothing striking here. Maybe it was because of the murky black and white television print that was available for us to watch, or maybe it was the story itself. I really wasn't invested in the outcome of the election, or even the fates of any of the characters. Both the plot and the acting in this movie just screamed B-picture. And even the Ronald Stein score, which I should have been able to appreciate, was a distraction because it sounded quite similar to a song from an old Donald Duck's Chip and Dale cartoon that had come out in 1953, just 3 years prior. In the cartoon, Donald is a zookeeper who keeps singing to his elephant, "It's a lovely day, Dolores. Everything is gay, Dolores." It's not exactly like that, but it's pretty close. And that's probably just a personal hang-up and not one upon which I should judge the Oklahoma Woman.
You sound like real 3 a.m. thoughts for you, Jeff.
I don't wish to imply that there is nothing to enjoy here. There are more than a few unintentional laughs. Almost any time anyone is holding a gun, they look so awkward and unnatural that it's hilarious. And the moment that we see Steve's wanted poster with Richard Denning's headshot on it, priceless. And of course, there's Dick Miller. As the bartender, he's in the background whenever a scene plays out in Oklahoma's saloon. And you have to give him credit, the guy's acting hard. He's never just standing there. He's wiping the counter or cleaning the glasses or just listening in on people's conversations and reacting to them. So if you get bored with the movie, and you likely will, you can always watch Dick Miller going above and beyond as the bartender. I don't know, maybe I would have appreciated the Oklahoma Woman a little more if it made sense. Marie needs her guy to win the election so she can run the town. But her guy is Jimmy Marsh, and he's running for re-election, so why isn't she already running the town? And how is an election at the state level going to be that beneficial to her anyway? The Oklahoma Woman is not a bad movie. It's fine. It's adequate. It's an intermediate film, and it's an eye for me.
Yeah, I agree that election was never completely explained. I also wonder how women could vote. I looked up when women were allowed to vote in various states, and I think this is supposed to be Oklahoma, and they didn't get the vote till the 1900s. And that's way after this movie.
Oh, we don't know for sure, but it's probably after this movie.
Or it could just
They never gave us a year.
Well, yeah. I'm going to chalk it up to a screenwriter error, though. So watch for the Dick Miller of it all.
So I think it's time to put the horses back in the stable and mosey on home. You've been listening to the American International Podcast, and I'm Jeff Markin.
And I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And we'll meet you at the drive-in. Follow the American International Podcast on Instagram and Letterboxd at AIP_pod and on Facebook at facebook.com/American International Podcast.
The American International Podcast is produced and edited by Jeff Markin.
A man whose mind is distorted by hatred.
And Cheryl Lightfoot.
A girl hungry for too many things.
The American International Podcast is part of the Pop Culture Entertainment Network.